We're firmly in module 2, April. And so last week we went over user personas, design research personas, and hopefully as you start to build that tool, we can use those personas and take them through journey mapping. And so that's what we're going to be here today learning about. I'm going to go over what they are, the difference between some of the tools, because you'll hear different language used and they're similar tools that do similar things. But we're not going to focus too heavily on the names of them, but there's a couple key differentiators that we want to look out for. If you want to work offline, journey mapping is one of the most fun and easy things to do just wherever you are. All you need is like either Post-its, pens, you can use a whiteboard, you can use your empty wall. It's very adaptable, and it's actually most useful when you can move things around in person rather than on screen. So basically, a journey map is a way to visualize the experience that a user has with any kind of service or product, any initiative, something that they directly interface with. So it can show the full arc of engagement. Sometimes that's called cradle to grave, or it can focus in on a particular part of the engagement, especially if it's like a larger system or if there's a lot of different pieces of engagement. And so a process map is something that often comes up adjacently when the term user map journey is brought up. And another term besides that is a service blueprint. So those things visualize how the back end works. So it's how the service actually is provided. It focuses on like the evidence, staff actions, support systems, all that infrastructure. So that is a really important piece to go along. So generally, I like to teach them both in conjunction with each other, especially as we build out these ideas. And so both tools can be used for essentially two different cases. One way is showing the current experience. So that's if there's a product or service that currently exists, you can map out that entire process as it is. You can also use a journey map or a process map to map out the ideal future state of the process. And so this is like the imagined future state once your idea is out and living in the world. And so one is realistic, one is ideal, and they both serve different purposes. But something they both do is visualize in detail so everyone can see, especially if you have a team or multiple stakeholders that are involved or required to fix that process. They can understand it. We can get aligned on that process. Sometimes you'd be surprised, or maybe you won't because you also work here. You don't always know what the other hand is doing. And so sometimes it just comes down to like one little piece where there's, a service gap, or there's challenges that you weren't aware of. And so it just becomes a very good visual tool to elevate and like make explicit those key points that you can either focus in to intervene. So that would be like this identifying the space where your idea is positioned well to improve upon, and as well as just like putting more meat on the bones of what you have planned in your mind for how you want the future role to look like. So an easy way, or really an essential way to start a user journey, is focusing on the user's goal, because you have to put the parameters around that journey, right? So it's like that's how we differentiate between, are we doing a cradle to grave experience, or are we focusing in on one aspect? So thinking about where the user is starting, just what task are they trying to accomplish? What job are they trying to get done? And so have that goal, like whether you're using Post-its or a digital screen, have that goal visible and apparent just so you can keep in mind what you're representing in that journey. The first thing, and I'm going to show you this, there's many different ways, I already said that, but I'm going to show you a framework that I really like. It's called the 5 E's. And so how do they enter the experience? So just thinking about that first step into the experience that a user takes. the rest of those Post-its or those, if you're using an Excel spreadsheet, this like one by one, you're going to map out the action steps that the user goes through to reach that goal. And so this is where the Post-its are really nice, or just the malleability of the tool, because you might go down the line and then you realize, oh, I actually missed a step here, or I missed several steps, or actually these steps are out of order. And so you're going to want to be as specific as necessary to really help you understand the intricacies of that process or the system that you're engaging with. So this can take time, but it's sort of a living document that is helpful to keep up visible to either yourself or the team as you develop. And so thinking about that final experience or step of the experience, so this is the point where they're done. They've finished engaging. Ideally, they've met their goal, and the engagement is over. The reason why it's called 5 E's is you'll see that you have it on the left side before they enter the process is actually, how do they even first hear about the experience? Sometimes entice doesn't necessarily feel appropriate depending on what kind of map you're making, but in this case, it's just an easy way to remember. It's like, how are you bringing them in? How are they learning about it? What access do they have to even entering in? And then beyond extend, or I'm sorry, exit, you have extend. So someone might leave the experience. It's probably important to think about how you're continuing engaging with them. Are you following up with them to make sure they're doing okay? Are you, utilizing something that how they impacted the service? You're just thinking about the extension of what that engagement does. So, so this slide is like, if you're using Post-its, you can use different colors to sort of think about what aspect you're trying to represent. Sorry, I'm I'm muddling over myself because I put something over the screen. I can't see what I'm saying. For the action steps, you can use one color. That's sort of just an easy way. If you back away, you can see how you're going along the process. The challenge or a pain point, if something comes up where you're like, I need to address this as something we need to look further into, or the user is having trouble here, that's not, you can use whatever color. Red or something bright is usually, associated with something like an error or something you need to pay attention to. And then generally I'll add like questions that I have for the stakeholder or questions that I have for the data. I'll put those in blue or a different color, just sort of to keep track of, because always when we're making these tools, we're answering questions, but as we answer, we get new questions that arise, and hopefully they're better questions than we had when we were going in. So thinking about the process map, now that we have these user steps, and generally I think it's a good call to maybe step or map out how you see the user journey first, and then move to the backstage. And you can essentially do this congruently, but it's easier if you sort of have one in mind and then you move into the next. Also keeping in mind that this isn't always a one-to-one. So if there's like 3 user steps, there might not necessarily be a back end step for every single user step, if that makes sense. So don't worry about filling in every single blank. You're really focusing on the touch points or when there's labor involved on the back end. And if you're using Post-its, you can use a different color again. And so I just wanted to point out different ways that you can actually map these out and give you like a visible example. So there's different fidelities that I like to play with when I'm working with process maps. And the easiest one, and especially when we were in, in-person offices, these kind of low fidelity post-it mapping process maps worked really great. I mean, they still do, again, even if you're at home. I encourage you, especially when you're sharing digitally, really anytime, use markers. Like a nice Sharpie is going to serve you well, because pen does not show up on camera very well. You don't want to have to be squinting. So you want to be able to like zoom into a photo and be able to see clearly what you're writing. So that's the one caveat that I encourage you. If you have sloppy handwriting, your future self will thank you for writing it out as nicely and succinctly as possible on a Post-it. And that's also the nice constraint of a Post-it, is you can't physically write that much on it. So you're forced to sort of keep one step very kind of as clear as possible and add as needed. So what I'm calling a mid-fidelity are these other digital tools. And these are tools that we've used more this year and that I've become more familiar with. Like, doesn't have to be Excel, but Excel is it's a tool that we all know, right? So onboarding is sort of not as difficult when you're thinking about bringing in someone new, an easy point of access for both of you. Excel has been a very helpful friend to me to just organize thoughts and ideas, and it applies pretty well to the process map. As you can see, like, you would move all of what would be Post-its are just moved onto a screen, and you're going to treat them the same. Don't overly fill them with detail. Save the details in a notes cell at the bottom, underneath a particular column if you have a lot of context that you want to add. You have these rows, sometimes they're called swim lanes of stakeholders. So if there's multiple stakeholders engaged, you're just going to think about every touch point that they have as different actions are happening. This one is for the Water Hardship Fund, where there's 3 different types of stakeholders that are engaging. And then the high fidelity, and I just put this in there so you can sort of get a sense, but I mean, there's no expectation of any kind to make a super high fidelity journey map, and there's all sorts of kinds of journey maps that are really cool to look at. You can just Google, and they get cooler than this, but this is one that I did for earlier last year, as we were learning about what restaurants were going through when they were trying to schedule COVID tests for their staff in around April through like June. So what this map did for us was it allowed us I started with something more like this, and I talked to different stakeholders that were dealing with that issue, restaurant owners, managers, frontline staff. And then we use this as a communication tool for basically the task force to make some decisions around improving that process. So the reason that this was more helpful to have a high fidelity was just, we had just more stakeholders viewing it. We weren't looking for any interaction at this point. This was a PDF, so it was a view only sort of thing that people could zoom in on, see specific quotes that I had pulled from that were relevant to certain pain points that were happening, so that they sort of have a sense of how different employees might be feeling about certain aspects of those difficulties. It showed us on a map the length of time that people were having to wait to take their COVID tests or wait to get their responses back. And I think we all remember how aggravating that was. And so this provided a lot of learning and sharing. I'm gonna switch out so I can see you guys, but ultimately I'd love for you to start a journey map for your idea, journey/process map. And so depending on what your idea is, you might not have a current process. There might not be, you might be inventing something completely new where a user doesn't exactly exist yet. So I like to just give the option of, if you want to do a current journey map where you really feel like understanding the current process and the difficulties that ensue in that process is useful, let's start there. If you want to start on a future imagined state, I'm happy to work with you on that as well. But that might be a more of a, dependent on what you guys want to do. I think, am I done sharing? Can you see me? Yes. So that's everything. Does it feel, is this the first time you've heard of journey or process mapping? Dan, hopefully not. No. Some of you, hopefully not, because I know I've worked with you on them before. Alex, did you say no? Have you worked with journey maps? Oh no. Okay. I wouldn't think it was a popular tool to use, but I'm always curious if people have heard of this before.
I would love to process map everything that we do, right? I mean, it takes a while, and the user input's hard to get, but your employees usually like moan and groan if you want them to participate in it. But I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, right? You can just knock out certain parts of the process, or I feel like it would be awesome to process map everything.
I'm with you on that, clearly. We're at 1:30, and I want to make sure if you have any questions right now, I'm totally open to hearing them, or thoughts, how you think maybe this, are you having trouble imagining this with your ideas? Do you see an easy point of access to applying this tool to your ideas?
Do you see this? So I'm thinking about how this dovetails with the stakeholder piece. So is it worth interviewing stakeholders to get more of a sense of their experience? Since we're kind of trying to improve a process, if we know their experience, and that helps us to map better. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So Sam, for you, that's exactly, first of all, yes, interviewing, just like the user personas, these are tools that you need to have research around them to have them be accurate, right? So for you, the user experience is going to be super important. And I think a really easy point just to map out the current process for what you're in, Bill's, and because then we can build another iteration that's future, and it'll just make more sense as to like how we're bridging that and improving it. So this is also a tool, obviously, that pays you back well, because when you're sharing this out at the end and you're having, let's say city leadership need investment from someone who just didn't understand that it was a problem before, or doesn't really understand why we care, this is a really useful tool to say, this is why you should care. And it makes it more available so that you can insert specific data of where the problem is too, not just, perceived pain points and, quotes around that, which I do think is important, getting the human perspective, but also you can input data of like, this is our baseline metrics of where we're starting, and here's actually how we've improved. So, but yeah, thank you. That was a good question. And Aaron, I see a similar, you have a different experience, but I think you'll have a good opportunity for journey mapping as well.
Yeah, I think with the user experience being sort of my focus too, I think that would be beneficial. I was just looking at Google to see if I could go over the steps again and sort of visualize what I will do. So let me figure that out. But yeah, I think it'll be useful for sure.
And Lisa, yours, I imagine, will be very useful, but once we get to that case study piece of where, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think trying to map out existing, it wouldn't really be a map. It'd be a mess.
But I mean, at the same time, yes, I hear that. And also sometimes, because people have to find, you're improving a non-existent process, but people are finding workarounds, right? And so
Sure.
people are finding that information one way. So if we're able to understand at least, one potential path that a resident might be using to get to that goal, we can show it with the improved process, like, look at how much shorter we made this journey for them. It's different than Bill and Sam's, where it's like there's a general structure for how this will work. For yours, it's like someone's going way out of their way. And that's how the water hardship process was, to be honest. So there was nothing digitized about that. And there were multiple county and city stakeholders that were needed to process this application for a resident who needed to take off work, come down to DSS, then walk over to water management with these like physical artifacts to get them like signed and approved and applied to their account. And a digital like public facing form alleviated all of that, all of those steps involved. So anyways,
Makes sense.
I can't see anyone else's like face that looks like it's got a question. So I think with that, I can just follow up as I have been with an email, and I'm going to give you just a few more resources to poke around with. I know I'm meeting with a few of you anyway soon, so we can talk more in detail. If I don't have a meeting with you and you want one, or with your mentor, please do that. So